What's up, adventurers? I hope you brought your lucky charms today because I'm taking away all your D20s. In this episode, we're rolling straight into one of the most iconic elements of Dungeons & Dragons, quite literally the D20. Have you ever wondered why this funky little 20-sided die became the heart of Dungeons & Dragons core mechanics? And is this really the best die to use? Today I'm going to break it down, and we're going to learn how the D20 shapes the game's balance, why its probability distribution works so beautifully, and what would happen if we decided to move to other types of dice like the D12, the D6, or even something a little more exotic. By the end, you'll see why the D20 is the secret sauce that keeps Dungeons & Dragons' unique flavor just right. So let's talk about it. I mean, really talk about it, because if you look at D&D's DNA, the D20 is basically the genetic code that tells the game how to grow. The whole system, the combat, the skill checks, the saving throws, it all revolves around a 1 in 20 chance. On the surface, it seems simple. Every number has a clean 5% probability. Roll a 20, you get to brag about it. Roll a 1, you may never hear the end of it from the rest of the table. But there's a philosophy behind this simplicity. Think about it. D&D is a game about stories, heroes, and epic moments. But it's also a game about math. Even if we don't like to admit it, the D20 is basically the sweet spot of complexity and elegance. It's large enough to create nuance between failure and success, but not so large that you need a PhD in statistics to know what's going on. It's a bit like cooking with salt. A pinch here or there can totally change and enhance the flavor, but you're not really busting out the molecular gastronomy kit just to season your fries. If we imagine a universe where D&D stuck with a D6, a six-sided die we're all familiar with from Monopoly or Warhammer 40k if you're more of a cultured folk like myself, things start getting weird. With a D6, every outcome suddenly becomes way more dramatic. Each face is about a 16.7% piece of the pie, meaning that your subtle +2 bonus now feels like an absolute game changer. The difference between rolling a 1 and a 2 on a D6 is enormous, compared to a 1 and a 2 on a D20. That means the DM's difficulty settings become less like using a delicate scalpel and more like swinging a sledgehammer. The granularity is gone, and with it, the fine-tuned tension that we've all grown accustomed to. On the other hand of the spectrum, with a D100, it would let you carve reality into teeny tiny 1% slices, which sounds super precise, right? Except, good luck making quick on-the-fly decisions as a DM. Suddenly, you're setting difficulty checks at a mind-numbing level of detail. Make a DC 57 check doesn't really roll off the tongue like make a DC 15 check. And players don't really want to feel like that they need a spreadsheet for simple stealth checks. The D20 kind of sidesteps this by giving you a nice round number that doesn't really send you into mental gymnastics before every roll. There's also a kind of charming democracy in the D20. You might say, well, obviously each number has the same chance, but that uniform probability has a subtle psychological effect. It tells players that anything can happen. Today you're a hero who slays the troll with a lucky 20, tomorrow you're a bard who pratfalls during a performance with a laughable 1. It's the game's way of saying, look, fate is capricious, get used to it. That unpredictability is part of what keeps us coming back to the table. And let's be a little controversial for a moment. Some people argue that D&D's reliance on a single randomizer this big, a chunky D20, limits the design space. They say if we had a different core die, we could create more varied probability curves and more interesting math, or represent skills and abilities in more nuanced ways. Sure, maybe. But consider this. One of D&D's superpowers is accessibility. The D20 is a gateway into the hobby. New players get it. It's not intimidating, it's almost friendly. It says, hey, just roll with me and see what happens. If you start the game with more complex dice or multiple layers of probability, you might as well hand out pocket calculators at the session. Okay, that's clearly an exaggeration, but you aren't watching me because I'm vanilla. Also, let's not pretend we don't love that moment of suspense when the die leaves your hand, somersaulting through the air, clattering across the table, and in that split second, possibility is infinite. The D20 is a symbol of this infinite potential. Yes, I might be being a little hyperbolic. Will you strike true, or will you falter? Or will you land somewhere in the murky, middling average that makes every eventual success feel earned? Okay, so the D20 sets the stage for probability in D&D, but let's talk about something a little spicier. How this single hunk of plastic, or metal, or resin if you feel fancy, or even gemstones if your pockets are deeper than mine, ends up being the foundational bedrock for the entire game's design. It is not just a randomizer, it's the engine humming under the hood of D&D, powering every rule, every mechanic, every dramatic reveal. When the designers at Wizards of the Coast, or TSR, back in the day, settled on the D20, they were basically saying, this is the standard unit of chance around which we build all other complexity. It's like deciding on the shape of the Lego brick before you start designing the entire Lego city. Think about difficulty class. They're the game's speed limit signs, telling you at a glance how tough a task should be. Picking a DC 15 lock, you know you've got about a 30% base chance if you're rolling a D20 straight, before you factor anything else like dexterity modifiers and thieves' tool proficiencies. So it's a neat little packet of math that's easily digestible for both the player and the DM. If the designers had chosen, say, a D12 system, suddenly a DC 10 versus a DC 15 feels a little bit out of whack. The increments get difficult and wonky. With the D20, they can fine-tune the game in 5% increments, which is like having a universal dial that can be nudged up and down without snapping off your hand. And speaking of dials, the D20 allows designers to add or subtract small bonuses without throwing the entire ecosystem into chaos. A +1 or a +2 bonus might sound trivial and small, but on a D20 scale, it's meaningful without breaking the game. That is the beauty of the D20. It's big enough to absorb all kinds of little modifiers, proficiency bonuses, weapon bonuses, ability, situational adjustments without turning every encounter into a math test. The game designers basically said, we'll give you a world of fireballs, dragons, and magical swords, but we'll keep the math simple enough so that you only need to count to 20. Honestly, it's kind of a gift. Some people argue that using a single D20 for everything is too flat. They'll say, wouldn't it be more interesting if different tasks use different dice to reflect different probability distributions? Maybe, but then you lose the simplicity and elegance that makes D&D so approachable. By rooting everything in the D20, the game designers ensure once you understand one core mechanic, you understand it all. Roll a D20. Add your modifiers, add other stuff, compare it to the target. You basically get how the whole game works. Attack rolls, saving throws, skill checks, they're all just variations on the same simple theme. This frees the designers up to get creative elsewhere, like developing new classes, spells, and abilities rather than reinventing the probability wheel for every scenario. It's like they've established a universal grammar for D&D. Nouns are the numbers on the die, verbs the modifiers, and the punctuation is the DC. Everyone at the table speaks the same language so that you can focus on the story rather than deciphering the hieroglyphics of game design and game math. And I don't want to forget about advantage and disadvantage, those clever little mechanics that spice up your roll by throwing a second D20. This twist changes your chances in a way that's intuitively understood by players. With one die, you've got about a 5% shot at any given number. With 2 dice taken at advantage, your odds of rolling, say, a 15 or higher jump dramatically. But you didn't need a spreadsheet to know that, did you? The designers can easily inject complexity without drowning you in fractions, because the baseline, the single D20, remains consistent. Of course, there is a bit of love-hate relationship here. The D20 is a blessing and a curse. Its simplicity is what makes D&D accessible, but it also means that you have to accept some randomness. If you're a control freak who wants guaranteed results or predictability, the D20 can feel like a frenemy, smiling in your face as it rolls a 2 at the worst possible moment. The classic, I'm a fighter who's mastered every combat style and has slayed hundreds of enemies, trips over the threshold because they rolled a 1 on a dexterity saving throw. But to me, that's part of the fun, right? The designers know that frustration and triumph walk hand in hand. The D20 giveth, and the D20 taketh away. And game designers lean into that tension to keep sessions lively. At its core, Dungeons & Dragons isn't meant to be a real-life simulation. It's a storytelling game that gives you the highest of the highs and the lowest of the lows. So the D20 doesn't just run the game, it sets the tone with things like D12s, D8s, D10s, D100s, and D6s and D4s all being a part of the core game. But by building the rules around the single die, the D20, the designers have struck a balance between accessibility and depth, stability and excitement. So what if we stepped through a reality portal and ended up in a world where the D20 didn't get the starring role? Picture a world where the king of the die is dethroned by a D6. Now on the surface, a 6-sided die feels cozy and familiar. We've all rolled them since we were kids, moving pawns around a board. But what does that do to Dungeons & Dragons' finely tuned ecosystem? If we swapped in a D6 for every ability check or attack roll, each face jumps up to a whopping 16.7% probability. That means that going from a DC 15 on a D20, which is a reasonable 30% success chance if you're rolling straight, to a DC 5 on a D6, roughly the equivalent challenge, jumps to something like a 33% chance. But wait, DC 5 on a D6 is almost the max number, and you're not leaving much room for subtlety. With a D20, you can whisper little +1s and -2s into the system and gently massage the odds. On a D6, every single step is a leap. The game design becomes like stomping around in heavier boots, rather than gracefully adjusting fine dials. It's either too hard or too easy, and nuance goes out the window. The game would start to feel like a series of coin flips with slightly more outcomes, and that carefully balanced tension that we rely on would evaporate like a wizard's familiar after a bad saving throw. A D6 alone would require a complete rework of the character ability modifiers and bonuses. A D6 works perfectly for something like a war game, but it just doesn't account for the varied narrative tools that we want in something like Dungeons & Dragons. So what about a D8 or a D12? These might seem like decent compromises. The D8 gives you a 12.5% per face, and the D12 about an 8.3. Closer, sure, but still less elegant than the D20's tidy 5% increments, like trying to paint a miniature figurine with a roller brush. It might work, but it's clumsy. Without the granularity of the D20, setting DCs becomes guesswork. DC 7 on a D8, DC 10 on a D12, these numbers feel less intuitive. Players might struggle to gauge their odds at a glance, and the sense of fairness and predictability that underpins D&D's drama might get lost in translation. It's probably at this point that you're saying, okay, you sound like a D20 fanboy and nothing that we say can convince you otherwise. Well, for Dungeons & Dragons, yes. But I want you to remember while you finish this video that Dungeons & Dragons is the quintessential starting place for the TTRPG hobby, and it should be as accessible for as many people as possible. And then I would advise you to look into systems with more epic rolls or nuanced rolls like the D100. And speaking of the D100, on paper, a D100 sounds awesome. 1% increments, perfect precision, right? Except, do you really want to decide that your rogue's chance of picking that lock is 53% instead of just saying DC 15? It's like using a scalpel to slice bread. Too fussy. You'd spend more time fiddling with the numbers than actually telling the stories. And players would quickly realize that in practice, it's just more zeros to read. The mental math gets heavier, and the streamlined flow of the game starts to clog up. Really, what's the difference in narrative terms between a 53 and a 54? Don't put that level of stress on your DM. They don't need it. What if we try a bell curve system? Rolling multiple dice and adding them together, say 3d6 instead of 1d20. Statistically, 3d6 yields a bell curve distribution centered around 10.5, meaning average rolls cluster around the middle. That might sound nice at first. More predictable results. But predictability cuts both ways, right? On a bell curve, getting extremes like 18 or 3 become less common. And if you love the wild highs and crushing lows that make D&D so memorable, a bell curve may feel too tame. It's like smoothing out the roller coaster until it's just a gentle train ride through the park. From a game design perspective, bell curves diminish the thrill of rare heroic moments. Under a 3d6 system, your character's chance of hitting that perfect 18 is much lower than rolling a nat 20 on a d20. The dramatic tension of a single die pop, that moment when fate could turn on a single number, gets muffled. Sure, you can still have critical hits and failures, but they'll feel rarer, less organic. And since the majority of your rolls hover in that comfy middle ground, every ability check or attack becomes an exercise in probably around average, right? That might be great if you want a more simulationist or realistic approach. Plenty of games do that intentionally, and it works great. But D&D is about heroics, unpredictability, and a spark of chaos that I like, personally. A bell curve turns your ragtag party of adventurers into a statistically predictable unit, which can dull the edge of the adventure. Also, think about modifiers. On a d20, a +2 bonus shifts your odds by about 10%. On 3d6, that same +2 might not mean the same thing in terms of shaping your outcomes. If the probabilities cluster in the middle, a small bonus interacts with the curve differently, and designers have to recalculate everything, from monsters, AC, DCs, hit probabilities, spell save difficulties. It all gets more complicated. Want a tough challenge? Just increase the DC. But since the distribution isn't flat, the relationship between DC and success rate isn't straightforward. You lose that intuitive 5% per step logic. Suddenly everybody's scrambling to figure out if a DC 12 is mildly challenging or impossible for the group's average skill bonus. The mental overhead increases, and not in a fun, I'm clearly outsmarting the puzzle kind of way. More like a where's my calculator kind of way, and should I have bought a graphing calculator, or does this one do? So while different dice or multiple dice systems can be intriguing, and they might fit other RPGs that aim for a more realistic or gritty, they chip away at what makes D&D distinct. The D20's flat probability puts everyone on equal footing. Every roll is a blank slate, every outcome equally possible, and changing the die changes the vibe. It morphs the gameplay feel from a swashbuckling adventure full of sudden twists of fate into something more predictable, more controlled, and arguably less thrilling. I briefly touched on it before, but another unique aspect of D&D's use of the D20 system is the advantage and disadvantage system. If you're unfamiliar, it's pretty simple. Roll 2 D20s instead of 1, and you take either the higher or the lower result, depending on the situation. It's elegant, it's brilliant, and it changes the probability landscape without drowning you in complicated math. But why does it work so smoothly, and what's so special about applying it to a D20 rather than some other die or dice pool? First off, on a single D20 roll, each number has that sweet 5% chance that I keep mentioning. Now when you roll 2 and pick the higher, which is advantage, you're naturally making it more likely to avoid those low numbers. Statistically speaking, advantage gives you a hefty boost. For instance, trying to roll a 15 or higher on a normal d20 is a 30% chance. With advantage, that jumps up to somewhere closer to 51%. That's a huge swing, but it still feels intuitive and natural. You didn't memorize a chart or pull out your T84. It's a mental shortcut, and everybody gets it immediately. Now, if we tried to apply this same system to a bell curve setup like 3d6s, things get a little weird. How do you apply advantage to a bell curve? Roll 3d6 twice and take the better total? Suddenly, you're looking at distributions of distributions. Instead of a nice, clean 5% increment that scales predictably, you have probabilities stacked on probabilities, each one interacting in complex ways. That goes from cool and intuitive to I need a flowchart in record time. The elegant simplicity of advantage and disadvantage thrives when baseline probability is easy to visualize, like a single d20. Consider how advantage and disadvantage feel in play. Advantage makes good outcomes more likely, without guaranteeing them, and disadvantage does the opposite. It tilts the table just enough that you notice the difference, but it doesn't break the game's fundamental rhythm. You're still getting that occasional low roll, even with advantage, and those comedic high rolls, even under disadvantage. It's like life giving you a wink that things are in your favor, but don't get too cocky. This delicate balance between altering odds and preserving suspense relies heavily on the flat probability curve of the D20. With the D20, you always roughly know what you're getting. Introduce a non-flat curve, and suddenly understanding your new odds is like trying to recite a tongue twister after 3 mugs of dwarven ale. I love talking about game design, as we dive deeper into these mechanics and appreciate the careful choices that go into making D&D feel both balanced and exciting. I want to share something that can help enhance your TTRPG experience even farther. You should consider checking out my Patreon. The partner video to this helps DMs with encounter balance. Supporting me over there is like unlocking an endless supply of bonus content, and it goes a long way towards helping me make TTRPGs my full-time gig. The link in the video description below. Because the entire system orbits around the D20, players learn to strategize with that uniform probability in mind. When you gain advantage through clever tactics like flanking or using a helpful spell to distract an enemy, you understand on an intuitive level that it's boosting your odds. When your DM drops a new house rule or a special scenario, maybe environmental hazards that impose disadvantage on perception checks, you can adapt without needing a formula sheet. The consistency lets players stay immersed in the story, and they're not stepping out to do complicated number crunching. Instead, they can focus on the narrative, the characters, and the choices that really matter. Could the D&D rule set work with another die at its core? Sure, anything's possible. But the question is, would it really feel like Dungeons & Dragons? The beauty of this system lies in its simplicity and the expectations it sets. Replacing the D20 would require rethinking all of the math, rebalancing all of the classes, altering all of the spells, and fine-tuning the DCs. The end result might still be a fun game, but it wouldn't capture that same timeless elegance. Good game design is often about finding that perfect fit, the just right piece of the puzzle, and I think that the D20 is that piece, enabling a wide range of epics, stories, and strategies without getting in the way. So, there you have it. The D20 isn't just a die, it's the heartbeat of D&D's design, and it gives the game its unique tempo, balancing complexity with accessibility, and transforms every action into a suspenseful roll of fate. If you found this exploration helpful or fun, give this video a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and definitely check out the links to my socials below, and even my new YouTube membership that gives you some cool, custom, handmade by one of my favorite artists, emojis. Until next time, my friends, keep rolling those dice, and may your quests be epic. Okay, somebody roll a D100. You need a 70% chance to succeed.